Liz, I think I'm going to do this microphone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Turn this one off then. And, well, it is a real pleasure to be here, and you can kind of feel the positive feeling in the room as you just walk in. And I just came in today. I was at our farm up in Orland, California yesterday for our celebration for the turkeys for Thanksgiving, where we actually feed turkeys instead of eating them. And so that's where I was, and I got in here like, and you know, one of our messages at Farm Sanctuary, and I think it's very much aligned with what's happening here, and with what Linda just said, is we want to live in a way that feels good. And most people in the United States grow up eating animals without really thinking about it. And that was the case with me. I grew up in a fairly large family, not 13 kids, but there were 6 kids total. And you know, everybody around me was eating meat. My parents were, my brothers and sisters. So I just started eating meat without thinking about it. You know, we are very much social animals. We tend to do what those around us do. And that's why an environment like this is so positive, because there are such great role models and everybody aspiring to live well and to live in a way that is kind and compassionate and aligned with our basic humanity, our empathy. And I think that's one of the most important parts of being human, is having empathy and caring for others. But most of us grow up eating animals without thinking about it, without thinking about the consequences, without wanting to in some cases, because it is painful. And oftentimes when the issue of factory farming comes up, people say, don't tell me, I don't want to know. And it is because it is upsetting. But I think it is important for us to be mindful and be aware and to ultimately make choices that we can feel good about and not live in denial. So as I learned about various issues growing up, you know, I wanted to make a difference. I didn't want to just get a job and you know, make money, which was what we're encouraged to do growing up in this country. So I started volunteering at Children's Hospital in high school, and I got involved with environmental groups. I got involved with various social justice groups. I started learning about factory farming and how it touches us all, because we are what we eat. And if we're eating food that is harmful to us, you know, we're killing ourselves. And we're also killing animals by the billions in this country. There are today about 9 billion farm animals raised and slaughtered every year in the United States alone. That's more than there are people on the planet. 9 billion every year. And they have horrible lives, and they're killed, and killing is an inherently violent act, and it is bad for the animals, and I would also say it is bad for the people. You know, I've been into these slaughterhouses and I've seen what this does to people. And the good news is we don't have to eat animals. I've been a vegan since 1985, and my health has been good. Last year, in fact, just to kind of demonstrate that vegans can do athletic stuff, I did several marathons, and I also, in July of this year, did an Ironman triathlon, just to, again, demonstrate that you get all the nutrients you need on plant-based food. And that is the truth. We can get all the nutrients we need on plant-based food. We are healthier physically. We are also healthier, I think, emotionally and spiritually, when we're not buying into and ingesting products of this cruel and unnecessary and harmful industry. So beginning in 1986, when Farm Sanctuary was founded, I started visiting farms and stockyards and slaughterhouses to document conditions. And we would start rescuing animals that we found just discarded and left for dead. And we now operate 3 sanctuaries, one in Orland, California, just about 3 or so hours from here. It's north of Sacramento, of I-5. It's 300 acres, and it's a sanctuary where the animals are our friends, not our food. We also have a farm in upstate New York and one down near Los Angeles. We currently care for about 1,000 animals. And once the animals come to Farm Sanctuary, they get to enjoy their lives and experience a different kind of relationship with human beings. And so much of this is about our relationship with others, and what should that look like. And in the case of animals who are exploited for food, they are seen as commodities. They are not seen as living, feeling creatures. They are seen literally as pieces of meat from the day they're born till the day they're killed. And so we treat them very badly. And again, that's bad for the animals, but it's also bad for us. How we treat these animals probably, in fact, says more about us than it says about the animals. And we start rationalizing and justifying our bad treatment of them, saying things like, well, they don't really have feelings. Or they, and forever humans have tried to make ourselves different than other animals and have come up with reasons, like we're the only animals that use tools, for example. And then we discovered other animals using tools. And then we started saying, well, we're the only animals that have language. And then the more we started looking at other animals, we recognized that they had language. And now the thinking is, well, we're different because we're the only animals that have souls. But do we really know that? And I would suggest that other animals have souls as well, and they are part of this earth we all share, and they are part of our life. And what we do to them is important and has impacts. So once animals come to farm sanctuary, they get to be who they are. Cows get to go out and graze, which is very different than how they're raised on these factory farms. Pigs get to go out and root in the soil, and they are very, very earthy animals. Pigs, you see these guys coming in with mud on their noses. And when they first come to us, animals are oftentimes very frightened because they've only known cruelty. But as time goes, they learn to trust us. They learn to play, and they start enjoying life. And they also start showing love, even. This is a turkey that lived at our farm in Orland, California. We used to call her Lydia the hugging turkey because she'd go out to the barn and sit down, and she'd come up to you and she'd crane her neck around your neck and give you a hug. So these animals would prefer to have a positive, friendly relationship with us. But they never know that in these factory farms. They only know cruelty. Now, as I mentioned, I grew up eating animals, despite the fact that I had my cat Tiger, who I loved. And most of us, or many of us, have known cats and dogs over the course of our lives, and we've known them as members of our family. We come to recognize they have personalities, and we come to love them. And I think this is sort of a natural human tendency, and children have a natural connection with other animals too. But as we grow up, we sort of become acculturated to accepting this idea that eating animals is normal. It is what we're supposed to do. But I think that's something that needs to be questioned. Is it something we are supposed to do? There was a book that came out a number of years ago, and in the intro, the author talks about how if humans are natural meat eaters, he's looking at that question. He says, if you take a child and put him in a room with an apple and a rabbit, and if he eats the rabbit and plays with the apple, I'll buy you a new car. And if you think about it, if we were natural meat eaters and we saw an animal bleeding or injured, we would start salivating because that's food. Or if we saw roadkill or dead animals, natural carnivores want to consume that, but we don't. If you look at our bodies, we have a very long intestinal tract. And natural carnivores have a very short intestinal tract because meat is a putrefying flesh and it has to get through the body quickly. But because we have a long intestinal tract, it takes, days sometimes to pass through us. And so you have this putrefying flesh at 98.6 degrees in a moist environment for, a long time. And colon cancer is one of the results of this problem. So we are not well designed to consume meat, especially the quantities we do in this country today. And there are consequences. The number one killer in this country is heart disease. The risk of it can be seriously lessened by shifting to a whole foods, plant-based diet. Number two is cancer. And then we have obesity and diabetes and these things that are huge too, also part of that whole matrix of health problems that are preventable by eating healthy food instead of eating food that makes us sick. So this meat industry is, and as I mentioned, I grew up eating meat. Most of us did, but it's not necessary. And I've got a couple of slides here from a book called The China Study by Colin Campbell, who's a nutritional biochemist at Cornell University. And the China study has been called the Grand Prix of Epidemiology, the largest study ever done to look at health and food. And basically he found the more plant foods we eat, the healthier we are, the more animal foods we eat, the more problems we tend to have. This just shows healthcare expenditures per person in the US versus other countries, and they're very high here. And a big part of that has to do with our very processed and very animal-based diets. And healthcare expenditures have been increasing. And again, this is something that is tragic. It causes a lot of suffering for people, and for animals, and it doesn't have to be that way. And it also causes suffering for the environment. I've got a couple of quotes here from a United Nations report called Livestock's Long Shadow. United Nations found that the livestock sector emerges as one of the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale from local to global. Livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. This is a higher share than transportation. So if you take all the cars and trains and boats and planes and combine the greenhouse gas emissions, it would be less than comes from animal agriculture. You know, to grow animal foods, we grow lots of crops, which then have to be harvested. And there's also petrochemical fertilizers that are used in fertilizing and growing these crops. And then you have pesticides and all these kinds of things too. So, and then when animals are killed, slaughterhouses use lots of energy. And then they have to be refrigerated or frozen because you got this rotting meat. And then it's being transported. So there's all these types of costs that go into animal farming. It's a lot more efficient just to grow crops and eat them directly. We could feed like 10 times more people if we were eating the plant foods directly instead of feeding them to animals. But something like 80 to 90% of the corn and soybeans produced in the US are fed to animals to be fattened for slaughter. Sadly, the meat consumption industry is spreading. And in places like China, where the economy is growing, meat consumption is also growing. So they're now starting to import soybeans from parts of Latin America to feed livestock. So this is a problem that's becoming more and more global. But it is one that each person every day can make choices about. It's just about thinking and making mindful choices. So that's really the key message: thinking, making mindful choices that we can feel good about, that are good, that are aligned with our values, but also aligned with our interests. It doesn't make sense to eat food that makes us sick, like we are in this country, and like Linda was referring to as well. It's very empowering to eat food that is good for us, physically and emotionally. So also from the United Nations report, the findings suggest that the livestock sector should be a major policy focus when dealing with problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. Livestock's contribution to environmental problems is on a massive scale, and its potential contribution to the solution is equally large. The impact is so significant that it needs to be addressed with urgency. This is the United Nations. Now this is from a New York Times article called Rethinking the Meat Guzzler, and in this slide the author compares the amount of fossil fuels needed for a vegetarian meal versus a meat meal. He finds it requires 16 times more fossil fuels for the meat meal. This is a whole other cost, the whole fossil fuel industry, and what we do to obtain cheap fossil fuels around the world is obviously very costly in many, many ways. And it's good that people are changing light bulbs, carpooling, reducing our waste in various ways, but changing how we eat would have a huge impact on our dependency on fossil fuels. And all these problems have been made worse over the last several decades by this agribusiness and USDA mantra, get big or get out. Small farms have been replaced by large industrialized operations that treat animals worse than you can imagine, that treat workers badly, that destroy the environment. They see animals and natural resources as raw materials to be exploited for profit. And we've had a race to the bottom, and we have horrible things happening today in factory farms, and I'll talk a little bit about that.
What's in yellow? I can't see.
What's in yellow is the average size of each farm. So the average size of the farm has been increasing. The number of farms have been going down. Small farms being replaced by these large industrialized operations.
The picture's large combines.
Oh, yeah, those yellow things are large combines, replacing the blue tractors. Now, when farm sanctuary first started in 1986, I felt it was important to see firsthand what was happening, so I spent a lot of time going into farms and stockyards. And this is a picture taken at Lancaster Stockyards, which at the time was the largest stockyard east of Chicago in Pennsylvania. It is where they buy and sell animals. So there's holding pens and there's an auction ring. And this is a guy, you know, prodding a pig in one of the holding pens. And what became apparent was the way I looked at these animals was very different than the way these livestock handlers looked at the animals. I would look into their faces, I would see the fear, I would see the pain, I would see the emotion there. And most people would. When you look at another animal, there's an individual there that has a personality and feelings and interests, and they suffer and they feel pleasure as well. But at the stockyard, they're literally looking at body conformation and muscle conformation. They are looking at pieces of meat. They're looking at meat on the hook, and they sell the animals by the pound. And so there's this whole different perspective. Are these living, feeling creatures, or are they commodities? Are they livestock? You know, there's stock to be sold, but they're alive. And there's a lot more focus on the stock and money side of it and less on the live side of it. And so going in, I would see these animals obviously very differently than the stockyard workers. And it reminds me of something that the executioners were told during the Salem witch hunts. They were told not to look into the eyes of the witches, because if you do, they'll cast a spell on you and you won't be able to kill them. And it's because we have empathy, because we care, because we're human. And this is one of the best parts of humanity that gets lost in this factory farming system. And I feel bad for the animals who deal with this. I feel bad for the workers who lose part of their heart. Now, behind Lancaster Stockyards, there was the dead pile, and this is a picture I took one day there. And there are dead sheep, dead cows. There's dead pigs also. They're out of the frame here. As we approached this dead pile, the maggots were so thick, you could hear them buzzing as they were devouring these carcasses. And off of this pile, the sheep at the far right lifted her head. She was alive. So we were stunned that a living animal would be thrown on a dead pile. We took her to a vet, thinking she would probably have to be euthanized. But as the vet started examining her, she stood up, and she lived with us for more than 10 years. And we found that there were downed animals often left on the dead pile or left in the alleyways, just discarded to die. And so we began a campaign at Lancaster Stockyards. And our position was that if an animal is too sick to walk, and the industry term is down animal, they're down on the ground. We said if they're too sick to walk, they should either be humanely euthanized or given proper veterinary care. They shouldn't just be left to die. They should not be dragged onto trucks and taken to slaughter, which were the common practices. But at the time, Lancaster Stockyards was getting ready to celebrate its 100-year anniversary. It was seen as a pillar of the community, and it was now being criticized by this upstart organization of vegans that lived in a school bus on a tofu farm. And funded the work by selling vegetarian hot dogs at Grateful Dead concerts out of our Volkswagen van. With the beer back years ago. But as time went, and as people started seeing what was happening to the animals at Lancaster Stockyards, the tide turned. And people did not think it was okay for live animals to be left on the dead pile. And we were able to get the stockyard convicted of cruelty to animals. And I went back there several years ago and I took this picture. The stockyard was overgrown. It has now been bulldozed and it is gone, I'm happy to say. And farm sanctuary has grown. This is our farm in Watkinsglen, New York. It's 175 acres. We have bed and breakfast cabins there. We have events. We're going to be doing a celebration for the turkeys there later this month, where the turkeys again will be the guests of honor. And this is our farm in Orland, California, where I was yesterday, and we did the celebration for the turkeys there. And these are sanctuaries for animals, but they're also sanctuaries for people. These are places where we can look at the animals and know that they're safe and feel good about it. But far from farm sanctuary on today's farms, bad has become normal. Farm animals are genetically manipulated, artificially bred, mutilated, confined, cruelly beaten, and then killed for food. Farm animals are specifically excluded from the Federal Animal Welfare Act, which most people are surprised to learn. You know, our hope and our assumption is that there are laws to protect these animals. But in fact, they are excluded from the Federal Animal Welfare Act. When it comes to state laws, agricultural practices considered to be common are excluded from most state anti-cruelty laws. And what is a common practice? It is one that the industry adopts. And if they start doing it, it's considered to be common. And no matter how cruel it is, it's considered to be legal. So you have practices now that have been developed that are horrible, but they're legal. And that has been the case for the past several decades. Now we've been working to change that, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but this is a situation where bad has become normal for animals, but also for consumers. And as we get older, it becomes the norm that you need to take heart medication. Or if everybody around you is obese, then that is the norm. And it doesn't have to be that way. That's the good news, is all of us can make choices every day that will make a huge difference, a profound difference for ourselves as well as other animals and the entire planet. This is something that all of us have a lot of control over. There's many things in this world we can't control, or it's hard to control. But when it comes to what we eat, each of us every day can make choices, and it's about developing healthier habits. You know, we grow up with certain habits, and we should be reflective and think about whether those make sense. Do we feel good about them? Are these habits, these food patterns that we develop, good for us? What do we, you know, and when we start asking those kind of questions, and we make choices that are aligned with our values and aligned with our interests, I think we're going to see a huge shift in this country, and we're beginning to see it a little bit. After our campaign at Lancaster Stockyards, I traveled around the country to document what was happening with downed animals. Again, these are the animals too sick even to stand. And this is a picture I took at a slaughterhouse in Southern California. These are downed cows that are being killed and used for human food. This is a picture I took of a downed cow in Texas. This cow was sent to the stockyard with her calf. And because they sell to different buyers, they were being separated. And the mother fought to be with her calf. And in doing that, she was forcibly separated and her neck was broken. And she fell and she couldn't get back up, and she was left there for hours, maybe for days. They refused to humanely euthanize her because as long as she was still alive, she could be sold for human food. And that's a picture I took of a calf in upstate New York. He was sent to the stockyard on the day he was born. He was still wet from afterbirth, and it was a freezing day, and he was dying of hypothermia. So I went up to a stockyard worker and I said, "What's going on with this calf?" And he said, "Well, I've got to bury him later today." And so I said, "Well, what if I take him off your hands?" And he said, "Sure, go ahead." So I took him to the vet, and his temperature was so low it wouldn't even read on the thermometer. And she said, "You know, this cat has a very low chance of survival. What are you wasting your time for? It makes no economic sense." And I said to her, "You know, to me, it's not about economics. This is an individual animal. I want to do what I can to help." And she finally gave him the intravenous fluids and treated him. And I'm happy to say that he recovered and ended up weighing 3,000 pounds. So that's Opie, and he lived with us for nearly 20 years. He died a couple years ago, I'm sorry to say, but he had a wonderful life. It was a beautiful thing to go out on the farm and to spend time with him. He was a very peaceful animal. And you know, we have these barns with big 10-foot by 10-foot doors, and when he would stand in that door, he'd pretty much occupy the whole space. So he was a gentle giant, and it was beautiful to see him recover. And you know, seeing him recover and seeing the other animals at the sanctuary recover, it helps us, in a sense, heal and recover as well. You know, seeing these conditions and seeing this cruelty over and over can take a toll. So the sanctuary is a place of healing for animals as well as for people. Now, Opie was born on a dairy farm. For a dairy cow to give milk, she, like other mammals, has to give birth. They don't lactate just for the heck of it. They produce milk for their babies. So on modern dairy farms, cows have a calf every year, and the calf is taken away from them immediately at birth. And then the mother is hooked up to milk machines 2 to 3 times a day. They're pushed to produce about 10 times more milk than they would produce in nature. And in addition to producing that much milk, they have a 9-month gestation period, and they're giving birth every year. So they're pregnant and giving milk at this intensive level. Their bodies are depleted, and they're sent to slaughter usually after just about 3 years of production. In a healthy environment, a cow would live 20 years, but on factory farms, they're sent to slaughter very young. That's a picture of a downed cow, dairy cow, being dragged onto a truck to be taken to slaughter. That picture was actually taken by a dairy industry veterinarian who was upset by what he was seeing. And he took that picture, he called me, he said, "This is horrible, we need to stop it." So we were able to get a law passed here in California in the mid-1990s to make it illegal for downed cows to be dragged onto trucks and taken to slaughter like this. So we've made some progress with that, and we were also able to get a federal ban on the slaughter of downed cows for human food. One of the reasons that the industry was not able to prevent that ban was because of the discovery of mad cow disease in a downed cow in Washington state during the time when that was discovered, we actually had litigation against the US Department of Agriculture. We were arguing that downed animals, those that are too sick to walk, are diseased. And diseased animals legally cannot be used for human food. That was our argument. The USDA responded to us and said that we were incorrect and that legally diseased animals could be used for human food.
Right.
And they had been arguing for years that there's no evidence of mad cow disease in this country. But when they admitted to finding mad cow disease, they agreed to prohibit downed cows in the food supply. So that's the current status of things. We're also now trying to prohibit other downed animals, like pigs, for example, who are too sick to walk from being dragged onto trucks and taken to slaughter. That's still happening. And it's still legal and common for diseased animals to be used for human food. In fact, if a farmer has a sick animal, usually what they'll do is, rather than providing veterinary care and spending money to treat that animal, they will cull them from the herd, which means they will send them to slaughter to be killed and used for human food. So that's still a common and, I think, an unacceptable practice that most citizens don't know about. Now, I mentioned how dairy cows have a calf every year, and the calf is taken away. If the calf is a female, she'll probably be raised as a milking cow. If the calf is a male, he'll never give milk. So the veal industry was created to take advantage of all these unwanted male calves born on dairy farms. And for a veal calf, they're chained by the neck in this small wooden crate for their whole life. And that's all they ever know. And then they're killed at about 20 weeks old. But they're not the only animals who are confined in this sort of situation. That's a picture I took in Missouri of pigs in gestation crates. These are called gestation crates because it's where these breeding sows are kept during their gestation period or their pregnancy, which lasts about 4 months. Then right before giving birth, they put them into another crate called a farrowing crate, which is also just 2 feet wide for the mother. She only has space to stand up and lay down. And when she lays down, the piglets can nurse through the bars. And they'll be in the farrowing crate for about 3 weeks. Then the babies are taken away to be fat for slaughter. The mother's re-impregnated and put right back in the gestation crate. So she has this constant cycle of impregnation, birth, and re-impregnation. They suffer both physically and psychologically. Physically, for example, from constantly standing on this concrete floor, they get sores on their legs and on their bodies. They're also driven mad, basically, engage in neurotic coping behaviors like bar fighting. And they'll live this way for several years. And the last confinement system I'll mention are battery cages for egg-laying hens. This is how most of the eggs are produced in this country, where the hens are stacked in these warehouses by the 100,000 birds per building. They're packed so tight they can't even stretch their wings. And their feathers wear off from constantly rubbing against the bars of their cages. Now, this has been the norm, but beginning in the early 2000s, we've now started to see some movement to ban these practices. The first such law passed in Florida. It was on the ballot in 2002, and it banned the use of gestation crates. And what we had been doing for years is we had tried to introduce legislation, and we had introduced legislation in state capitals and in Washington, D.C. to give these animals more space. But the agribusiness industry is very, very powerful. So they were able to kill all of these bills, which were usually referred to the Agriculture Committee. And the Agriculture Committee is made up of lawmakers very sympathetic to agribusiness. So sometimes these bills would be introduced, referred to the Agriculture Committee, and they would die without even a hearing. So what we did in Florida was we took this issue to the people. We collected over 500,000 signatures to qualify the measure for the ballot. And it was on the ballot in 2002, and voters in Florida voted to ban gestation crates. After that, we went to Arizona. And again, we introduced legislation. It died in committee. We then went to the people. We collected signatures to put a measure on the ballot to ban gestation crates for the pigs and also veal crates for the calves. And that was on the ballot in 2006, and it passed. And then in 2008, we brought the same effort here to California. And many of you maybe remember Proposition 2. It was on the ballot in 2008. And in addition to gestation crates for pigs and veal crates for the calves, we included battery cages for egg-laying hens. And California is, as many of you may know, the #1 agricultural state in the country. It's the #1 dairy producing state. It's one of the top egg producing states. So this measure was going to impact the lives of about 20 million animals in California. The industry spent about $10 million trying to defeat it, but despite that, California voters voted by a nearly 2-to-1 margin to ban field crates, gestation crates, and battery cages. And that sent ripples through the industry. And we're now at a time where the industry recognizes that their practices are out of sync with societal values. Most people don't think this is okay. So we have some movement, and they're giving the animals a little bit more space, or they're making some voluntary efforts in that way. But what I would say about those is that those are very small steps. And we now have a situation where there's a lot of awareness about factory farming, with YouTube and Facebook and social networks and some of these campaigns. And so meat producers are now starting to market foods as free range. And it sounds better, but those labels tend to sound a lot better than they are. And free range only requires that animals have access to the outdoors. But that's not defined. So access to the outdoors often means you have thousands of animals in a warehouse and a little door that goes to a crummy little paddock. That is access to the outdoors, and that is now free range. And there are not many farmers that treat animals very well. Even these humane farmers don't treat animals very well. And there's such strong demand now for alternatives to factory farming meat. So you have high prices that are put on these products. And so that's the current status of things. And I think it's important just to remember that we don't have to eat animals. And this idea that free range is better is something that is not always the case. And the fact is we can live and do very well by eating just plants. Now these are the egg-laying hens. There's about 300 million egg-laying hens in the US who are confined in these cages. Their lives begin at these hatcheries. And both male and female chicks hatch at these hatcheries. In the poultry industry, there are two distinct types of birds. There are the egg-laying chickens that are specifically bred to produce a lot of eggs, but they don't grow very big. And then you have your meat-type chickens who've been genetically bred to grow twice as big and twice as fast as normal. So at the hatchery that hatches out the egg-laying hens, you have male and female. The male don't grow fast enough to be raised profitably for meat. They'll never lay eggs. So what happens to the male chicks born of these egg-laying breeds? They're literally thrown away. That's a picture I took behind a hatchery in Pennsylvania. There were live chicks with dead chicks discarded there. So there's another picture at a hatchery, and this is actually a manure spreader. We have live chicks being thrown in the manure spreader to be spread on the field like manure. That's a picture I took at an egg factory in New Jersey. Now I had gone in there to document the battery cages, and as I was getting ready to leave, I came across this trash can of dead birds, so I took some pictures. And as I was taking the pictures, some of the birds in it were moving. So I removed them and brought them to Farm Sanctuary. And then we tried to prosecute this egg factory for cruelty to animals, for throwing living birds in a trash can. And their lawyer argued in court that they could legally treat the birds like manure. And the judge was a little bit surprised to hear him be so blunt about this and said, isn't there a difference between live birds and manure? And their lawyer said, no, there's no legal difference. And that egg factory is found not guilty of cruelty to animals, just to speak to how bad things are. And here's a quote that I think is very fitting from Ruth Harrison, who wrote a book called Animal Machines. It was published in 1964 in Europe, in England, and there are now laws on the books in Europe for years to prohibit some of these practices. In the US, we have had much less progress until very recently on humane laws for farm animals. So if one person is unkind to an animal, it's considered to be cruelty. But where a lot of people are unkind to animals, especially in the name of commerce, the cruelty is condoned, and once large sums of money are at stake, will be defended to the last by otherwise intelligent people. So bad becomes normal, and we are social animals. And if everybody's doing it, it becomes accepted as okay. But it shouldn't be. And the last animal situation I'll mention are the chickens that are raised for meat production. And they live in these huge warehouses. And as I mentioned before, they grow twice as big, twice as fast as normal. They grow so fast and so large, in fact, that their hearts and lungs have a hard time supporting that massive growth rate. And every year, millions die of heart attacks at just a few weeks old. And their overweight, unhealthy condition somewhat perversely parallels that of us in this country when it comes to obesity. I've got a series of slides here now from the Centers for Disease Control showing obesity rates in the US starting in 1985. The darker blue colors there indicate 10 to 14% of the adult population obese. By 90, we see that spreading. 95, we now have a new darker blue color indicating how much worse the problem is getting. 2000, we have a new color indicating just how this continues to spread and gets worse and worse and worse. 2006, the last one I have available. You see, it's just gotten worse. And this is, to a large extent, a result of how we eat, but also exercising is important. And it speaks to the profound impacts of our food choices. And we can live and be healthy, and we don't have to cause other animals to suffer. And we don't suffer either, so it's a win-win. And the environment doesn't suffer. It makes all the sense in the world to shift. And to give a sense of sort of the emotional rationalizing that we go through, I think human beings are primarily emotional animals. We do things because of how it makes us feel. And if it doesn't make us feel good, we've got to come up with a lot of reasons why we have to do it. And we grow up with certain myths. We grow up believing that you need to have meat for protein. And you need to drink cow's milk so you get calcium so you don't get osteoporosis. These are things we grow up with. But these are myths. And as I mentioned, I did an Ironman triathlon earlier this year just to demonstrate that. And I was also in Toronto not too long ago at a Toronto vegetarian event. And there was a guy there who's a strong man from Germany, the strongest man in Germany. He participates in these contests where they lift cars and do that kind of stuff. And he broke a world record, carrying the most weight any human has ever carried. And he's a vegan. He carried like 1,200 pounds on his back for 10 meters. And before he did this, he actually had to put some braces around his shins. I mean, his thighs were about, 36 inches in diameter. But his shins, he actually had to put some braces around there because of the concern that the bones could splinter, as crazy as that sounds. But anyway, he carried this 1,200 pounds, 10 meters. And that's a world record. Guinness Book of World Records was there, set by a vegan in this strength category. And he was getting all his protein and everything he needed from plants. And with regard to this notion that we need to drink cow's milk for calcium, in our country, we drink a lot of cow's milk. And we also get a lot of osteoporosis. So if drinking cow's milk prevented osteoporosis, we shouldn't see it like we see it, but we do. So what is the reason? Well, there's a great movie out of those of you who haven't seen it, I'd recommend, if you're interested in the health side of this especially. It's called Forks Over Knives. And the idea is with forks, we can prevent scalpels and heart surgery. And in that movie, the experts estimate we could save 70% on healthcare costs by shifting to a whole foods plant-based diet. And with our budgetary issues and economic challenges we're facing in this country, shifting to a whole foods plant-based diet and saving 70% on healthcare costs is massive. And there's our healthcare system, and there have been some genuine efforts to improve that. But one of the best things we can do is to look at how we eat and to take control of our own health through and our food is the biggest part of that, I think. So in terms of the emotional rationalizations we go through, again, we tell ourselves we need this stuff, so I don't have a choice. I have to eat these animal foods. In fact, we do have a choice, and we do not need to eat these animal foods. One of the first visitors to our farm in Washington, New York, was a pig farmer. And he went into our pig barn, and he saw these young volunteers taking care of these 500-pound sows. And this pig farmer was genuinely worried about the welfare of our people. He said, those are huge animals. They are violent, aggressive animals. You better get out of that barn or they'll attack you. And this is a pig farmer, and I said to him, well, we've not had that experience here. And he responded and said, look, I'm a pig farmer. I understand these animals. You can't trust them. And, you know, frankly, the way he's speaking is more about himself than about the animals, right? And to illustrate his point, he said that he had a sow who had babies. He took the babies away, and she came after him. And that became the rationalization for it. You got to put it in the crate. And, you know, there's that quote, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so he now has this perspective that these pigs are violent animals, they have to be confined. And this is then now rationalized, and this becomes his reality. And our experience is very different. The animals become very loving when they're shown love, just like people. People who are abused have difficulty too, you know? Animals are the same. If they're treated with kindness, they respond with kindness. And one of the other stories that the industry has is that they need to keep the animals in the crates, in the case of mothers and baby pigs, because the mothers will hurt their babies, which is completely counterintuitive. You know, mothers have kind of evolved over a long period of time to nurture and raise their young. But the factory farming pig industry actually believes that they need to keep the mothers separated from the babies. These are crazy ideas, but this is believed by this industry. But to kind of dispute that notion, we have the example of Nikki. This is her at our farm with some of her babies. Now, Nikki was confined in a gestation crate in Iowa. And the floods came there several years ago. And unfortunately, many, many animals died in the crates. But some, like Nikki, were able to escape. And so she found high ground, she got on a levee, and she gave birth. And she was caring for her babies. So obviously she wasn't killing them like the industry thought she might. And so we sent a rescue team, brought her to Farm Sanctuary. And when we go into the barn with Nikki, do you think she attacks us like this pig farmer was saying? No, she doesn't. She knows she's in a safe place. And Farm Sanctuary is a safe place for the animals and also for people. One of our organizational values is that we speak to people where they are. We recognize that we grow up in a society where eating animals is normal, and that change is scary. You know, sometimes people say, I want to be vegetarian, so I'm going to go get some tofu. And they get a tub of tofu and bring it home, and it sits in the refrigerator for a while, and they go, what do I do with this? And then the expiration date's coming up, I'm going to cut a piece off and try it. I don't really like that. So it's about learning new habits and eating food and enjoying food. And as a vegan, there's so much that is now available to us that was not available when I went vegan back in 1985. I remember for soy milk, you had to get like powder, mix it with water, and it was kind of clunky usually. But now you get all these different kinds of soy milks in grocery stores, mainstream grocery stores. We even have big dairy industry companies now starting to invest in plant-based alternatives to cow milk. There's like almond milk, there's soy milk, there's coconut milk that you can get all over the place. And that is a very positive sign. And you know, when you come to Farm Sanctuary, you know, you can actually see animals smile, which is pretty sweet. And you contrast that to what you see when you visit a factory farm, where you have animals that are literally clanking against their bars to get out and screaming and in misery for their entire lives. And when you work in a situation like that, you know, as a person, you become hardened, you become desensitized, and you start, you know, you stop looking at the animals as individuals. And I think cruelty and callousness can jump the species barrier. And so you have people that work in these places who then go home and sometimes don't behave very nicely there either. And in communities where you have these industrial operations, you have all kinds of social problems. And there's something called the Goldschmidt hypothesis. He was an anthropologist back in the 1940s, and he compared a couple of communities in California, one where you had a diverse group of small farms, and one where you had an industrial farm. And what he found was that in this industrial farm place, you had much more problems with alcoholism and violence within families and things like this. And that's not something that is in anybody's interest. So I really think that, violence creates more violence. And kindness can create more kindness. And it can become contagious. And that's why it's so beautiful to be in a place like this with you all, where kindness exists and is strong and is contagious. So just want to thank you all, and I'm happy to take questions if anybody would like to.